Hi, my name is Glenn Peterson. We'll get started if everyone wants to sit down, please. I'm with the California delegation on the Metropolitan Water District Board. I'm not going to try to make your problem my problem or mine yours or anything right now. I'm here to introduce Katrina Grants. Katrina has done some great things in Colorado, and you probably all know what they are. She works out of Salt Lake, and she's an engineer. But Tanya put together a little bio on her, and Tanya said she's great. And I said, well, that's cool, So I know a lot of leaders like, Catherine the Great and people like that were known for being great. And so I thought, Katrina the Great, that works, And then she said she's smart. I don't know if anybody has a, Ivan the Smart. I mean, I know Ivan the Terrible, but not smart. And then she says nice. She's nice. And I thought, oh, God, that's a real tough one. There's nobody that was ever nice that was a leader, but she's a nice lady. She's great, and Katrina's going to introduce the panel to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for the kind words, and thank you, Glenn. So good morning. As I've been introduced, I'm Katrina Grants, and I work for the Bureau of Reclamation. I'm the Adaptive Management Group Chief there, and I'm also the Program Manager for the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. And I feel honored. I have a distinct pleasure of moderating this panel on collaborative environmental initiatives across the basin. In my work with the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program and in my work on the Glen Canyon Long-Term Experimental Management Plan, EIS, I've learned that collaboration is really essential to any project, to the success of any project. Bringing in diverse interests early on really results in success down the line because it just results in lots of different ideas, different perspectives, and things that you might not have thought of if you were just moving ahead with your, with how you normally do things. So this collaboration really is key to the success of any program and in particular environmental initiatives. So with that, I would like to briefly introduce, and then before each speaker, I'll tell you we're joined on this panel by a diverse group of very talented individuals. We have Rob Billerbeck of the National Park Service. We have Kristen Green from the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. Chris Harris with the Colorado River Board of California. And Edelyn Kuja with the Nat Nature Conservancy. So Rob Billerbeck is going to go first, and we'll go down the line, and each person will speak for about 20 minutes on describing their work on environmental initiatives and collaboration around those initiatives. And we'll have a couple minutes after each speaker for questions. And then at the end, we'll also have a little bit of time if there are any cross-cutting questions for once you've kind of thought through how the different pieces fit together. So Rob Billerbeck is the Colorado River Coordinator for the National Park Service. He is out of the National Park Service Denver office, and he coordinates internally and externally regarding water and resources issues for the Park Service Colorado River Steering Committee and for the 11 national park units that participate in that committee. He has also been the NPS project manager along with the Bureau of Reclamation co-lead counterparts on the Glen Canyon Dam Long-Term Experimental and Management Plan, EIS, since 2011. Prior to his work with the NPS, he was the head of the Colorado State Parks Natural and Cultural Resource Stewardship Program and managed their ecological and cultural inventory, resource planning, and compliance. He was also the manager of the state's conservation program and the Colorado Natural Areas Program, which provided monitoring, protection assistance, and advice to land managers for the conservation of Colorado's most special areas. Rob has a master's degree in sustainable development and conservation biology from the University of Maryland. So please join me in welcoming Rob.
Well, thank you. Good morning. I am very excited to be here today. As Katrina mentioned, She and I have worked for many years together on the long-term experimental and management plan for the Glen Canyon Dam. So I think that is a great example of some collaboration on the river. So it's a pleasure to talk with many of you about this. Many in the room have been part of that 5 years. And for those that haven't, we can tell you a little bit about, some of the lessons learned along the way. So with that, I'll try and switch over. Okay. Great. So for those who didn't live this for the last 5 years, what this is about is a plan to reoperate Glen Canyon Dam, to work with the Grand Canyon Protection Act and other provisions of law. And I'll tell you about that in a little more detail. Basically, the plan looks at how waters move between Lake Powell and Lake Mead, what it did do, or does do, will do for the next 20 years, is look at changes to the monthly, daily, and hourly releases. What it did not do was change the annual amount of water that goes between the two lakes. Again, many of you lived many of years of your life doing the 2007 guidelines. So that is what controls the, along with, of course, many other aspects of the law of the river, controls the amount of water that moves between those. And one thing that's unique, of course, that many folks who work with Glen Canyon Dam know is that there's the Grand Canyon Protection Act. So not something that's all across all of the dams in the West. This is a very specific law to the Glen and Grand Canyon, and affects how Glen Canyon Dam is operated. And for the aspects of collaboration, what I can talk about a good bit is what it was like to be in a joint-led process. I think for reclamation, it was a very interesting thing to work so closely with the National Park Service. We were joint leads given, obviously, Bureau of Reclamation's role in operating the dam, and for the National Park Service, our role, because of the Grand Canyon Protection Act, of managing the land below the dam. So this relationship of being joint leads wasn't always easy. I think my previous counterpart before Katrina, Beverly Heffernan, I think will show up here today. I don't know if she's in the crowd, but she could probably attest to the fact that it wasn't easy to work together as two agencies with different missions on this big of a project. But it did give us a really great experience to discover the strengths and the differences between our two agencies. And I think we were able to really draw upon some of those strengths. For the National Park Service, I would say it was an interesting learning experience to see some of the ways in which we approach some of our planning using as many words as possible sometimes. And a lot of our staff are very, very passionate. And sometimes that passion can make it a little difficult to have some conversations. So that is something that was uniquely combined with Bureau of Reclamation's staff, many of which are engineers and think very differently than biologists and planners in the National Park Service, and offered a lot of efficiency and a lot of practical nature, which I think we capitalized on in this plan. So it gave us really a chance to work through some of those differences, look at our ways of doing planning, and focus on the big picture in terms of this project. And I think what happened was we developed a very strong working relationship through this, and we ended up having a very strong project, I think, because we had those different perspectives inside the tent on this. And I think it produced a stronger, more carefully thought through project than we might have had otherwise. And so many of you know a project like this on this big of a dam, there were many federal agencies involved, so Bureau of Reclamation, National Park Service. We had Argonne National Labs writing most of the text. Fish and Wildlife Service was intimately involved throughout, given the endangered species. And then, of course, we had the great fortune of having the USGS intimately involved through the Grand Canyon Research and Monitoring Center. So it's not every EIS where you have a large team of scientists who've been working on this for many, many years to support the work. And if that didn't seem like a lot of people involved, then here's the list of cooperating agencies for the LTEM. So a much longer list of government agencies, tribes, and some other associated parties. And if that list doesn't seem long enough, then there's the adaptive management work group. So this was a large group of people that have been meeting and have very vested interest in how the dam is operated for many years. So you have not just federal agencies and tribes, but you have the 7 basin states, you have the federal power purchase contractors, environmental groups, recreation interests, and actually I got the federal power purchase contractors on the list twice, I see. So Leslie James, that means you were very successful in making sure that I represented you very well in this process. So, but this was a challenge then to figure out at the beginning of this process for 5 years how to organize this and how to approach it. And again, for our agencies coming from different planning backgrounds, trying to figure out what level of engagement to have with the public, with stakeholders, cooperators, tribes, and government agencies. And one way to approach it that some agencies do when there's very complex, difficult issues is really to try and avoid doing some of the engagement and do it all yourselves behind closed doors. That was not the approach that was set for this process. Really, Ann Castle's leadership at the very beginning set a tone of very open and transparent process and a lot of engagement, and helped us figure out how to work between not just cooperating agencies, but also with that established long-term FACA group of the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management. We did have, on a very complicated process like this, a lot of engagement from solicitors up front, so that helped us make sure we were following the process we needed to, while still doing that, engagement of going a little bit, above and beyond what was required. So we did do extra public meetings to solicit input on alternatives, and we did quite a lot of meetings with those AMWIG stakeholders every step of the way to look through the goals and get input on them from the desired future conditions they had been working on, and then work through our approaches to modeling and analysis, and then work through actually the alternative concepts. So many people who have been doing this for the last 5 years know that that was a great number of meetings, so we appreciate all of the time spent on that. I think a couple of other keys to that coordination, we're working with the Fish and Wildlife Service very closely throughout. Again, the leadership of Ann Castle and Lori Karamanian, particularly at the beginning, helped us make sure that we involve them closely so that when we got to the end of this, there were no surprises. That indeed we had worked things through with the Fish and Wildlife Service to have a very robust approach to endangered species. And then with tribes, we really tried very, very hard to involve tribes throughout. I think taking maybe a unique level, given the Grand Canyon Protection Act and the fact that so many tribes are so passionately invested in the Grand Canyon because of their traditional association with it. So we did work closely with tribes, and they asked for some involvement in different ways than had been done in past processes, and working that through with solicitors and with the tribes, we were able to engage with them in some different ways. We worked through trying to capture some of their interest in quantitative ways that I'll talk about a little bit more, which was maybe a different approach for them, so that as we went over charts and graphs and quantitative data, we could make sure some of the tribal interests were included in those discussions where possible. We also had requests from the tribes to have input throughout the EIS document, not to have all of their perspectives packaged in one section, as often happens under a cultural header. Instead, we included perspectives throughout the document under many resources. So that, I think, helped. I think the tribes felt engaged. I'm not sure they felt like it was perfect. And again, I feel like I personally learned some things through the engagement there on how to do that better, and I think we got better throughout it in how we worked with tribes. And I think with power and water, coming from my background of more working with the National Park Service and planning there, I think I gained great respect for water and power, and I think we worked very, very closely to ensure that throughout the process we were looking very carefully at the analysis and working through a lot of the language and concerns, particularly on water issues, to make sure that indeed this process did not inadvertently affect other processes. And I think with the AMWIG FACA, we had the opportunity to engage very closely with a number of stakeholders who might not have had that type of engagement in this process were it not for that established FACA group. And then it was also an interesting learning experience working with a large group of scientists who have great ideas all throughout the process, and to figure out how to corral that and capture that enthusiasm and those ideas into a very careful analysis. So that has been an interesting process. And I think a few of the keys to the collaboration, I think, were that we had to figure out, as I mentioned, how to deal with some of that science. And I think there's an interesting connection between how you approach the science on a complicated process like this and how that relates to collaboration. So we had an abundance of science. That's an unusual problem to have in an EIS, to have so much science that it's difficult to parse through it all. And we had to decide at the beginning for which topics we would approach it quantitatively versus qualitatively. And I think that actually affected how we collaborated, because we made the conscious decision to approach it more quantitatively where possible and to use more models. And we also dove in to do an explicit treatment of the unknowns. We had some help from Dr. Mike Runge, who's an expert with USGS, and helped us carefully qualify where the limits of our data were so that we could look explicitly within the modeling at unknowns. And you can see just a little bit of the modeling. It was pretty complicated and pretty interrelated. Those are all different boxes for different core pieces of the modeling. And what that quantitative approach allowed us to do was have some accessible ways to look at a lot of the analysis and compare between alternatives. Again, we also had robust qualitative analysis in the document, but it did provide us the way to do that. And I think there's some of the tricks, some of the takeaways for that I came away with was, one, the wisdom of Larry Wachowiak. Many of you know him well, and he reminded us throughout the process that all models are wrong and some are useful. And so that was a good help throughout for people to realize that the models are a great thing to compare, and you do have to look at how they were created very carefully and look at the limits of them. But I think the modeling and the quantitative approach, the real focus on that, allowed us to really move off of some black and white positions and move towards evaluations of the levels of impacts, the levels of the shades of gray in this process, and define boundaries for interests between different groups. And I think it would have, even though this took 5 years to do, I think it could have taken many more years had we not had more quantitative approaches to help us define those. I think it's easy for folks to retreat to a corner and see things as very black and white. And I think we also were able to be open to innovative ideas, like creating a hybrid alternative based on some of the characteristics of alternatives that were created by different groups. DOI had an alternative that we thought was really great, and there was an alternative that was pulled together by Basin states and Western Area Power that they thought was really great, and there were others created with other input that were really great. However, when we looked at the quantitative modeling, we were able to pick and choose some aspects of each to try and incorporate and to try and address different interests and different aspects that could improve different resources. Okay. And we also looked at how to structure some of this through an approach called structured decision analysis. I think one of the lessons learned on this is that if you're going to use that process, which has become popular in more recent years from Fish and Wildlife, it's very important to work with stakeholders up front with how it's going to be used. I think one of the lessons learned we had was that there was a great deal of fear that it might be a decision box, that you put information in and you pull out a decision. And I think that's most certainly not how we used it in this process, but I can see why that fear was there. And so I think it helped us, some of the concerns from stakeholders, make sure we used it appropriately. But I think one thing it did do was trying to fit things in that way allowed us to look at how we were looking at the quantitative data, what units we were using, and what variables we were looking at to make sure we were looking at things that really mattered to stakeholders and using units and ways to evaluate them that were accessible and comparable. And I think that was one of the strengths that we got out of that process. But I think some of the magic of collaboration on the Colorado River that I would say we got better at through this 5 years of process was learning when to use small groups of people in a face-to-face meeting, and have frank conversations. And you have to have many large meetings with many people, but the combination of the two can really help work through some difficult issues and difficult language. And finding the right timing and sequence and involvement in those is always the art rather than the science of how to do these processes. But I do think that allowed us to sit in a room and really listen and try and work through what some of those concerns were, and gave us time to work through and develop those personal relationships that are really important to get past some of the positions. It was not fast to do things that way, and it took us 5 years, but I think it was the right way to do it, and I think it was worth it. And we also built into the process some ongoing collaboration via adaptive management. So for the LTEMP, every year there will be recommendations for experiments, reporting of the status, but then there will be a communication and consultation process with those involved stakeholders, which I think will help ensure that as we learn things through the process, that we are addressing those concerns of stakeholders throughout. And we also have a comprehensive review after 10 years. So I think the outcome is really, I think we have a well-backed alternative that came from that collaboration, that careful working through with those small groups. And so I think the takeaways for us were involve solicitors early and often to make sure that you're following the process carefully and wording things very carefully. But involve the diverse group of stakeholders early. I think that's definitely a lesson for other processes like this, because I think it makes it robust and it allows you to address a lot of the concerns up front. And more of those perspectives that are inside the tent working it through with you, the more robust the process is. And I think really taking that time to develop those relationships and understanding the perspectives and getting the input frequently from those stakeholders. I think that structured decision analysis was an interesting tool, and I would say using that carefully, not as a decision box, but as something that's one piece of much of the decision process. And I think modeling more is one of the things that we take away as something that actually created more opportunities for that consensus, and explicitly in that modeling dealing with the unknowns. And then building that adaptive management process for ongoing work. And then the trick of that right combination of small and large groups working throughout and that openness to innovation. But I would say working through really difficult processes like the Glen Canyon Dam does take a while. And I am really glad to be here today at the end of 5 years for an exciting conclusion to the long-term experimental and management plan. And I think the collaboration that was set by Ken Salazar, Sally Jewell, Ann Castle, Jennifer Gimbel, Tom Eisman, Lori Karamanian, and Camille Tooten has allowed for that collaboration to really succeed. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions before we move on to the next speaker. Are there any questions? Can't tell. Okay, then we'll go ahead and move on. Next up is, and you can, if you think of something later, we can have a couple minutes at the end. Next up is Kristen Green. Kristen is a senior hydrologist with the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. and where she works on projects specific to the Colorado River Basin, such as the System Conservation Pilot Program and the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project. She's New Mexico's representative. Apologies. Time was up from the previous one. I better make that, turn that one off. She's New Mexico's representative on the San Juan River Basin Recovery Implementation Program Coordination Committee. Ms. Green has a BS in hydrology from the University of New Hampshire and an MS in hydrology from the University of Arizona. Please join me in welcoming Kristen.
I'd like to start just by thanking you for the opportunity to talk about the San Juan River Basin Recovery Implementation Program. So I'm not going to go into details on how we're trying to recover the fish, but talk about the collaboration within the program and how we're working externally as well. So the program is part of an Endangered Species Act, Section 7 consultation. So I'll talk about the two major goals, which are to conserve populations of the endangered fish in the San Juan Basin and to proceed with water development. So I'll start by introducing you to the two species. The Colorado pike minnow and the razorback sucker. Both were once abundant and widespread in the Colorado River and its tributaries. The Colorado pike minnow, probably a fairly grainy photo of George Clooney, but it's a big fish. It was historically 6 feet long, up to 80 pounds, a little thinner than George Clooney, but it's a substantial fish. It's also the largest minnow in North America, which isn't that surprising. Also called the Colorado squawfish or the white salmon. Lots of reports of early settlers relying on this as part of their diet. They can live as long as 40 years old. Nowadays, folks, or researchers are seeing them up to 2 to 3 feet long. And they were listed as endangered in 1967. The other species, the razorback sucker, also lives up to 40 years and grows up to 3 feet long and was listed as endangered in 1991. So a little bit about the basin. I'm sure a number of you are familiar with the San Juan River Basin, a little black and white, but you can see the Four Corners area. Durango, Colorado, and Farmington, New Mexico are also on there if you can see it, and Navajo Reservoir. Navajo Reservoir is one of the original Colorado River Storage Project Act reservoirs. And prior to it being built, the San Juan River and the 3 tributaries upstream were chemically treated to remove trash fish. These lethal concentrations were detected as far downstream as Farmington, New Mexico. This was all prior to the Endangered Species Act of 1973 and to either species being listed as endangered. The bottom corner there is a picture of Navajo Dam and Reservoir. So since this program is based on the Endangered Species Act compliance, just a really basic primer on that act. So any activity by either a federal agency or which involves a federal nexus must comply with Endangered Species Act. This relates to federal funding, federal projects, water contracts from federal projects, right-of-ways. Any of them have to go through this compliance, and it requires consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and avoidance of jeopardy to the species. So after this act was implemented, there were Section 7 consultations in the San Juan Basin in the late 70s and early 80s. But there wasn't a lot known about these fish. Didn't have the populations, or we didn't know about them. So these Section 7 consultations just resulted in finding of no jeopardy. So we had a new process that had to be followed in order to implement these projects, but nothing had changed too substantially. And this would have continued until the late 80s. A couple of biologists were gathering data, and they documented a spawning Colorado pike minnow in the San Juan River. They also found the presence of razorback sucker were still in the river. So this reinitiated consultation on one of the large projects going on at the time, the Animus La Plata project, which is around Durango, Colorado. That top picture is Lake Nighthorse, which was first filled in 2012. So this project, they realized that past impacts from pre-ESA projects were having adverse impacts, as well as this new project coming online. So in order to conserve the populations of the endangered fish and to continue water development in the basin, something had to be done. And one of the recommendations for the reasonable and prudent alternative required a program. All parties with a stake in water development or water management or endangered species had to come together and create actions that would help to conserve and protect these two fish. So in 1992, a cooperative agreement was signed. This is the current list of program participants, and up until that last presentation, I thought it was a really long list. Yeah. So we have 2 states, we have 4 Native American tribes, 4 federal agencies, as well as water development interest and conservation interests. And so this group did not just sign a cooperative agreement, they also agreed to actively participate. And I think this is the most important part of this program and why it's deemed a success, is because they're not just letting somebody do their work, they're actually educating themselves and working to help make this successful. So on top of that, the United States agreed that recovery actions will provide the ESA compliance for future water projects and all pre-program projects. They also agreed that they'd comply with state law and interstate stream compacts, as well as not just take water for the endangered fish. They also agreed to cost share the funding of this program. So the other parties, the tribes, the states, water development interests and conservation interests, they agreed to, again, actively participate and help recover these species. They also agreed to provide cost share funding and request funding from Congress. And so the non-federal participants have gone every year to DC to request funding from congressional delegates. They update update folks on the program, how it's moving forward, how recovery efforts are going, and what kind of budget we need for the future. So the other big part of this program is the structure. I'll start with the coordination committee. Each of those participants has a member on the coordination committee. It's the only decision-making body of the program, and it makes decisions by a 2/3 majority vote. So not one person on the program can just derail a project. So there's a lot of discussions. It's a large group, but also small. This coordination committee ensures program goals are met in a timely manner. They establish program policies, direction, procedures, and organization, and they approve the annual work plans and budgets. The other committee, the biology committee, is a technical arm of the coordination committee. They also are represented by each program participant. They're the ones deciding what kind of recovery actions should be taken, or how to implement these recovery actions and how to actually recover these species. And the biology committee isn't just state of New Mexico wants to appoint somebody to that committee. That person has to have a technical background. And if it's a new member, the biology committee actually evaluates their background and determines whether or not they should be part of the program. So on top of those 2 committees, we also have the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Reclamation filling a couple different roles. They are participants and voting members on the coordination committee, and they're also on the biology committee. But on top of that, the service staffs the program office. They help run the program, coordinate activities, they set up the meetings, keep everybody on the same page. And they're also ultimately responsible for the Endangered Species Act compliance. Every 2 years, they do a sufficient progress review on the recovery actions to make sure that we are on track. The Bureau of Reclamation, they also help with coordination, and they manage the funds. They're putting together the budget for the program. They also operate Navajo Reservoir, and there are releases for the endangered fish, so they help work on that, and ESA compliance. And so, as Katrina mentioned earlier, I am the state of New Mexico's representative on the coordination committee. I've been on the committee for about 2 years, and I am very much a junior on that program. Some of the members have been there since 1992. They're a wealth of knowledge, but they're also really good at adapting. They listen to new ideas, and they're as well as everybody else on the committee, they're really looking to recover this fish, these two fish. So we have our internal structure, and I think it functions pretty well. Of course, there's always struggles. But we also don't isolate ourselves. The other major program in the Upper Colorado River Basin is the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program. They were formed in 1988, prior to those populations being known in the San Juan, so hence the two separate programs. And 2 of their 4 fish are the same 2 we're trying to recover. So we collaborate. Some of the biology and coordination committee members overlap onto that program, as well as some of our federal agency participants. So having this communication between the programs allows for less overlap. Our funding stretches a little further, and really getting a better understanding of how to recover these species. Now, on top of that, there's an annual researchers workshop where folks from both of those programs, as well as any program within the Colorado River, are encouraged to attend and present information. So, as I mentioned, the San Juan program provides ESA compliance for past or pre-program projects and future water projects. There's a total of 329 projects to date, of which 23 of those are in New Mexico, and over 650,000 acre feet per year, which some have calculated equates to around billions of dollars in economic activity. 4 of the New Mexico projects, we have the Navajo Indian Irrigation Project, the Hammond Conservancy District, the Navajo Reservoir, and the San Juan Chalma Project. San Juan Chalma Project is a trans-basin diversion that provides water from the San Juan Basin to the Rio Grande. And it provides water to the Albuquerque-Bernalillo Water Authority, Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, and Santa Fe County, just to name a few. So this program provides compliance for all those water uses. I'm not sure a lot of them know that, though. So I actually tried to add more to this, but I was having a little bit of a blank on the San Juan program struggles. There are a number of them. Ones that came the top of my head first were how to recover the fish. Biology is not simple. There's no one answer. And I recently attended a workshop with the biology committee and was amazed at how many different opinions the different committee members are representing different agencies, and they have different backgrounds, and they are creating different hypotheses and testing them and constantly adapting to what will or won't work. So that's, to me, it's fairly impressive that they're continuing to determine how to recover these species. The other is 2023. That's the end date right now. And this is the date when those participants go back to DC and talk to the congressional delegates. This is the date they say we're going to recover the fish. We don't know if we're going to. That's the goal. Everybody's actively working in that direction. But if it doesn't, if we can't downlist or delist the fish by 2023, what happens? What happens to our funding? Where do we go from there? If we do downlist or delist, what happens then? We still have years of monitoring. We still have some parts of the project we have to continue, such as fish passage. So there's a lot of unknowns, but these unknowns are known, at least the known. Anyway, so we are working towards those. Successes. We have, Fish and Wildlife Service has said we've made sufficient progress every time they've reviewed it. We've simplified and streamlined the Endangered Species Act compliance. We've avoided costly litigation. And this isn't, this is as far as ESA compliance. Nobody has sued us saying we're not in compliance for these projects. Complied with state water law and interstate stream compacts. Good communication within the program. We have bipartisan support, which is always impressive. And that's actually the end of my presentation. So.
Thank you, Kristen. Are there any questions for? Thank you, Kristen. Are there any questions for Kristen? Pause a couple minutes. Okay.
Thanks.
Our next presenter is Chris Harris. Chris is the Deputy Director of the Colorado River Board of California and has been with the board since August 2000. Chris is involved in most of the board's major programs and activities associated with protecting and managing California's rights and interests in its Colorado River water and hydropower resources. Please join me in welcoming Chris.
Morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I always enjoy coming to CRWUA. I sat down the other day, and I think this might be my 20th or 21st CRWUA, and it's always so cool to see so many old friends and make new ones, and I just want to wish you all happy holidays. I've also been before you a couple of times over the past 10 or 12 years now since we've been implementing the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. And I really don't want to go through what the program is. I think most of you know we've been implementing it since 2005, but I really wanted to kind of key in on what my colleagues up here on the panel have been talking about, the collaboration, the coordination, the adaptation, the communication, and the cooperation that we have undertaken with each of these efforts that we're up here telling you about, and how we're so much better today working together collaboratively in managing the entire basin's natural resources. And I think this is something that all of us need to kind of pat ourselves on the back on, because I can remember 20 years ago when there was a lot of hell no's with respect to environmental management of natural resources in the basin. So I think we've made great strides, and we continue to make great strides. And I think, you know, the story that Rob told and Kristen just finished telling us about the San Juan, and Edelyn will follow up, it's worth paying attention to and realizing just how far we've come, and binationally as well as here within the country. I have my friend Jennifer Pitt sitting out there, and many of my Mexican colleagues. So this is a tale that we all share, and really what I wanted to do was just quickly go through what we're doing in the MSCP in the context of collaboration and communication and coordination. It's probably worth just quickly running through what the program is. It's a 50-year program. It was started in 2005, so we're expected to go through 2055. We have 26 covered species, so it really is a multi-species effort. We have more than 57 participants in the program, and they include states, non-federal interest, energy and water agencies, tribal interests, and many, many federal agencies. It also provides Endangered Species Act compliance for both the federal government under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, as well as Section 10 ESA compliance for non-federal parties in the program. And also the program planning area, for those of you who don't know, runs from the full pool reservoir elevation of Lake Mead down to the southerly international boundary between the United States and Mexico. And in 2015, we celebrated our 10th anniversary of program implementation, and we have an obligation to create 8,132 acres of habitat along the lower Colorado River, and to date, through FY15, we're at 4,700 acres. So we're actually ahead of our build-out schedule that we had planned in our original documents. We also have an obligation to stock nearly 1.2 million native endangered fish back into the system, and to pick up on Kristen's program in the San Juan, we manage two fish, one in common, the razorback sucker and the endangered bony-tail chub. And razorbacks, that is something that we are indeed managing. Bony-tail is a much more problematic fish. It's very, very rare. I'm not aware of bony-tail in the wild any longer. I think they're pretty much stocked now based upon a broodstock population that the Fish and Wildlife Service manages. But we have managed to repatriate almost 73,000 bony-tail back into the lower Colorado River since we began implementing the program. And right now we're spending about $30 million a year in implementing this program. So that's habitat restoration, that's native fish rearing and stocking, that's monitoring, so on and so forth. And I really think this map is a great way to talk about what we're all doing sitting up here in this panel and telling you about our programs. And Rob started off with the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program that kind of fills in that reach of the river between Glen Canyon and Lake Mead. Kristen just got done telling us about the San Juan Basin and the recovery program there. And then you do have the Upper Basin program that Kristen mentioned and the rest of the Upper Colorado Basin. We also have the Virgin River Recovery Program, a small recovery program that's doing great work for native endangered fish in the Virgin River watershed. Then you have the Lower Colorado River MSCP. And finally now, we're actually collaborating together between the two countries in working with the Mexicans, our Mexican colleagues, to restore and maintain native riparian habitats down in the Mexican portion of both the Colorado River and its delta to the upper Gulf of California. Just to show you a map of our program planning area, and you can't read this, and I don't expect you to, but each one of those little black dots along the river are now existing conservation areas, and we've got 3 more in the queue and several more that will be coming in future years here. And then the box on the right is actually one of our conservation areas in the northern end of the Palo Verde Irrigation District, where we have a truly neat collaborative effort underway where we've worked with agricultural users and very senior priority water users in California to develop a large, over 1,000 acres of native riparian habitat on former ag land. And we irrigate it using the district's water system, and we have profound success there with not only growing cottonwoods and willows, but now the yellow-billed cuckoo, an endangered bird that we manage for through the program, have really taken to this patch of habitat. It's been a really great success. I think the cool thing about this program is, and I need to really point out that the Bureau of Reclamation has done a sterling job. They're the agency that implements the program on behalf of all of us. So we contribute our funds each year. It's 50-50 cost shared between the feds and the non-feds. And then Reclamation puts together a work plan and a budget, and they've got the equipment and the staff, and they're biologists, they're restoration professionals. It's truly remarkable. But Reclamation's folks and some of the contractors that work for them, we actually go out across the basin and in fact even west-wide and look for how can we learn to better restore habitat. When we first started the program, we actually were out there digging holes by hand and pole planting. Now we treat it like a crop. We have flats of these tiny seedlings of cottonwoods and willows and mesquites, and you go out there and you can plant hundreds of acres in a day rather than half an acre in a day. And this is how you make big patches of habitat. You've really got to get out there and just get it in the ground. And the old adage is if you put water on there, it'll grow, and it does. And I invite any of you who drive Interstate 10, stop in Blythe, get yourself some lunch, and drive up to the north end of the PVID, and you'll see the cottonwood grove up there. It's pretty visually stunning, and it's remarkable when you think what the Colorado River used to look like when there were large patches of that native riparian habitat. But the bottom line is we had to learn how to do that, and the way you learn is you share information. You go out and talk to other folks. How did you do this? What worked? What didn't? And Rob kind of got to it in his talk with the LTEMP process. Our fisheries biologists actually go up and attend biology meetings both in the San Juan program and the Upper Colorado. We're dealing with species in common, so you have to be able to trade information. We have academics, the scientists who are doing work on these species across the basin, and our fish guys go up there and spend a lot of time with these folks in learning how to better manage both razorback and bony-tail. The other thing that we're trying to do is that all of the monitoring data that we collect is archive it and manage it in such a fashion that it's useful to other programs who are also working on these same species. So you can access it, you can interpret it, and everybody's comparing apples to apples. And that's something we had to learn. Early on in all of these programs, we tended to be somewhat insular, and I think we're learning to be not so insular anymore, but really reach out and build upon one another's successes and learn from one another's failures. I'm not sure why this isn't advancing. There we go. Structural habitat for the southwestern willow flycatcher has been a conundrum for us. We build this good cottonwood willow habitat, but we still don't have flycatchers going into it with any regularity. Every once in a while we do get one that will stop, hang out for a few days, but we're not getting them breeding, and nesting and breeding in our restored habitats. So there's some issues there, and we're trying to figure those out. So we've been traveling around over to the Rio Grande, the Salt River in Arizona, and actually using LIDAR and looking at the structure of the habitat, both the overstory, the trees, and the understory, and then also looking at the soil conditions, moisture, how often are the trees watered, or is there flooding under the trees, the proximity to water, flying insect production availability, all of those parameters, and trying to tease out what's not working in our site. And I think we're starting to get a better handle on it. Like I said, the yellow-billed cuckoos, maybe he's a bit more of a generalist, but he seems to be doing well in our habitats. But still, along the lower Colorado River, the willow flycatcher is nesting in salt cedar. The other thing is, all cottonwoods are not the same, and we've done genetic research in cottonwoods, even along the lower Colorado River and down in Mexico. They leaf out and flower and seed at different times of year, and they're all Fremont cottonwoods, but they're a little bit different. So we're really trying to match up our cottonwoods with their geographic location along the lower Colorado River such that they act as naturally as possible. I think the other thing that's been really great about this, everything that we've learned through implementing these conservation and restoration projects along the lower Colorado River, we've been able to tackle problems. How do you manage salt cedar coming back into your native riparian habitats? How do you manage non-native species, not only plant species, but terrestrial species or aquatic species? What happens if you have wildfire in a patch of habitat that you put in and just spent $26 million restoring and maintaining, and you have an obligation under the Endangered Species Act to have this habitat functioning? So we've had to sit down with regional wildfire agencies, entities who fight wildfire, the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the two states of Arizona and California, and even in Nevada, and put together a fire management strategy and response plan such that if there are fires that break out along the river, we ensure that high priority spots for suppression and management are our conservation areas. We still have wildfire. We just had a big one up on Havasu National Wildlife Refuge, I guess it was last year or year before, and it actually burned through a patch of occupied southwestern willow flycatcher habitat. And these are the types of things where we're trying to respond quickly and efficiently and get firefighting resources to these places. But you have to sit down and think your way through this. The other thing is we have a chunk of the Colorado River that is the limit between Morelos Dam and the southerly international boundary with Mexico. And we've actually worked between the two countries and with NGOs in both countries to establish two conservation areas in the limit, one in Miguel Alemán on the Mexican side, and then the Hunter's Hole just above SIB on the United States side. And in fact, we're evaluating if there's the potential for additional conservation in that reach of the river. It's very dry typically, so you actually have to physically move water to these sites, whether it's by pumps or with canals. And then the other thing is, it is an international boundary, so there are law enforcement issues. You have to work closely with the Border Patrol, and that's been challenging in and of itself. But we're learning how to do that, and we actually have now the ability for our biologists to go out and monitor and work with their Mexican colleagues and coordinate with CBP so that they can get out into that area and not raise a ruckus. I think the other thing is we recognize that there are linkages between our programs, and an excellent example is the humpback chub. While we do not physically have humpback chub in Lake Mead South, the humpback chub is a very important component to management at Glen Canyon Dam and the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program that Rob talked about. So what our program has done as part of our conservation measures and our biological opinion that we have for this program, we have $500,000 that goes to the Fish and Wildlife Service that they can use at their discretion for humpback chub conservation efforts. Because we recognize that over the life of our program, it's quite likely that some chub will migrate down into Lake Mead and potentially be affected by our operations down there. We also have reached out to the Fish and Wildlife Service and their fisheries projects and their hatcheries primarily, because we have to get brood stock, for example, of bony-tail, very, very rare fish, and the only way you can repatriate them to the lower Colorado River is you have to grow them up from the parent population they have over in Dexter, New Mexico at their national fish hatchery there. We only had one brood population there, though, and it's always given us pause. If something catastrophic happened to that hatchery, what would happen to that population? We could lose it. So the MSCP is helping the Fish and Wildlife Service establish a second brood population at the Mora, New Mexico National Fish Hatchery, so that all of us can utilize these fish. But it's a benefit to us and our program, but we also recognize that we're going to have to work together with all of the programs that manage bony-tail to ensure we have something, maintain some of this genetic diversity going forward. And then finally, we actually are collaborating with the Upper Colorado region of reclamation and stakeholders up there in the context of razorback sucker use of the Grand Canyon reach of the river between Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Mead. We know now, the biologists in the Glen Canyon program as well as our biologists have found razorbacks migrating back and forth from Lake Mead into Grand Canyon. So we're collaborating together, pooling our resources, and trying to understand better what's going on with the razorbacks in Lake Mead and Grand Canyon. Another really, I think, exciting area that has had a lot of benefit west-wide, in fact, North American-wide, from an ornithological perspective, and that's monitoring avian productivity and survivorship. There are a series of these map stations across the United States, in fact, in Mexico and Canada as well. And biologists go out routinely and put up mist nets, catch the birds, measure them, monitor them. Sometimes they pull feathers for genetic sampling or a spot of blood. And then that data is all input into one centralized database and shared. And we use it to monitor the productivity of our restoration sites. And it's been amazing. We have a substantial amount of monitoring data pre-MSCP, and the types and numbers, abundances of bird species that we're using the lower Colorado River. Now we're seeing species we haven't seen in years, and the abundances are increasing. So it's same thing with bats. We work very closely with the Western Bat Working Group, and we've collected a lot of data on not only bats' habitat use, which a lot of times they didn't know much about before, but we're also finding their roosting spot, identifying the mines and caves that they utilize sometimes miles away from the lower Colorado River. They come out at dusk and forage along the river and then go back before dawn. So we've really been able to contribute to the general knowledge of many North American bat species. Maximizing benefits. Every one of us up here will have to, we tell you that you can't implement a program like this without working with the local interests, whether they're sporting interests or agricultural interests. You've really got to get out there, educate, and work collaboratively with your publics. This thing is built upon coordination and cooperation, and so we've had to recognize that the lower Colorado River is a heavily utilized recreational spot. Everybody wants to go there when it's hot, get out on their boat. They want to go fishing and swimming. They want to camp. They want to go out for the September dove hunt, shoot quail, things like this. In our Peaver habitat north of Blythe, that we actually allow archery deer hunting there in the fall. Our species have long since moved south, so it's a great place to go, and the desert deer are getting in there now, and it's got some really great sporting opportunities for the people going over to the river. Yuma East Wetlands is a heritage site down in the Yuma area that builds off of the history of the Yuma Valley and the travelers across the West in the 1800s, and the tribal, the cultural aspects of these habitats. And that's all of these things we have built into our conservation areas and work very closely to ensure that there's a community connection to the habitats. Go into the schools, talk to the kids. If you get 7-year-old kids, 10-year-old kids invested in these habitats now, when they grow up and are adults living in Blythe, farming the land there, those conservation areas mean something to them. Down in the Yuma Valley, they get invested in it. That's the way we advance programs like this. Adapting with the times. Adaptive management is critical to everything that each of us is going to tell you. Just this year, we added a new species. We didn't even know this critter existed along the river, the northern Mexican garter snake, the photo on the right. They had not been seen on the lower Colorado River in nearly 100 years, and we just this year found one. And we know there are more of them up along the Bill Williams River in Arizona. So we know that we're going to find more of them now that we look for them. So he's now been added as a covered species, and we're going to begin implementing specific conservation measures for him. I'm almost done, Katrina. Challenges moving forward. Obviously, we're going on our 16th year of drought in the Colorado River Basin, and that's challenging for each one of us in the context of our environmental programs. Climate change, what does that hold? This is a long-term program through 2055. If things warm up materially and the basin continues to maintain drought conditions in more years than not, that's going to be an issue for all of us. What does it mean to managing and maintaining these habitats so that they function? Maintaining the genetic diversity of our native fish, because the non-native and native interaction in the lower Colorado River is staggering. It's something like 98% of the biomass in the lower Colorado River is non-native. So these guys really have the deck stacked against them when we put them in the river. And while we don't fully know how to manage that interaction right now, we do know it's up to us to at least protect and maintain the genetic diversity of the species, so hopefully down the road we get better at managing the non-natives in the river. And then I think sort of our other challenge is to continue to maintain our relationship with all of these other programs, coordinate and collaborate and cooperate as much as possible in communication. Forums like this are a great way to do it. Our program manager and his staff are constantly out doing presentations. They've gone to the Everglades. They've gone up into the Pacific Northwest. Interior is a big fan of these multi-stakeholder processes that can address large landscape scale regional environmental problems, whether it's endangered species or water quality. The Salinity Control Forum is another great example, but this is the way you do it. And that's it.
Thank you, Chris. Are there any questions for Chris? Yes, we've got one there.
Just a quick question with regard to willow flycatchers' reliance on cameras in the Lower Basin. Are you monitoring for camera speed? Do you have any responses? And then from the collaborative side of that, are you in contact with the groups in the other part of the basin that are working on that issue?
Yeah, thanks, JT. That's great. In fact, first part, why do the willow flycatchers like the tamarisk? One, they exhibit strong site fidelity. So flycatchers in the past nested in these suitable areas of salt cedar habitat that may be close to water or had moist soil conditions that were right, or the microclimate conditions were right. We're still trying to ferret that out. And then try and figure out how can we coax the little guys to move over under our habitat? How can we make our habitats that were created more conducive to them coming over and nesting and breeding there? Second part, are we monitoring for the salt cedar beetles? Yes, there are two of them. One is kind of working its way down the lower Colorado River, and I think if John's Sweat's in the audience, I think it's kind of down maybe Davis Dam area. We kind of expect it to hit Havasu National Wildlife Refuge, which has an ocean of salt cedar, relatively soon, maybe in the next year or two. There's another subspecies of tamarisk beetle that's moving across from the Rio Grande Basin, and we kind of expect to see it in the Yuma area maybe again in a few years. There's kind of a silver lining with salt cedar beetle, I think. One, we've always struggled with how to control salt cedar. Well, you go up on portions of the Virgin River, there are large areas where 100% mortality has been achieved. So there's an opportunity to get in there and reestablish native riparian vegetation. So we'd like to think, as we move forward with implementing this program, maybe we can kind of follow behind the salt cedar beetle and go in and cherry pick some of the better spots and restore it with some of our native riparian habitats. Our reclamation is looking at that. And each year we get a report. In fact, at the end of January is kind of our annual science report out conference that we have up in Laughlin, where MSCP folks tell us what they're finding and tracking. With respect to flycatcher, Ken, kind of going back, we are going over to Elephant Butte Reservoir. There's a large patch of native riparian habitat, and there's some salt cedar too, I guess. But we do have nesting flycatchers in there, so we're trying to look at the relationship to the soil conditions, the structural density of the habitat. Same thing in the Salt River, right above the delta of Roosevelt Lake. There's functioning habitat there. So we're actually trying to look at those habitats and then come back and see if what is it our habitat's lacking, or what do we need to do differently? Do we need to water them more at this time of the year and maintain this % moisture content in the soils and so forth? But the scientists and biologists involved in the program, these are all things that they're working on. Great question. Thank you, JT.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to our final speaker. Once again, thanks to Chris for his excellent presentation. Our final speaker is Edelyn Koja. Edelyn is a policy associate with the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River program, where she works on legal and policy issues related to supporting strategies for restoring healthy rivers to benefit nature and people. She has an MS in Aquatic Sciences, Environmental Policy and Conflict Resolution from the University of Michigan, and received her JD from Vermont Law School, where she focused on water and environmental law and alternative dispute resolution. Prior to joining the Nature Conservancy, Edelyn practiced water law in Colorado and served as an attorney at the Colorado Water Trust. Please join me in welcoming Edelyn.
Thanks, Katrina. Can you guys hear me? All right. Thanks, Katrina. As Katrina mentioned, my name is Edelyn Koja, and I'm a policy associate with the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River program. The other panelists have shared their experiences working on specific programs to help recover species, but I've been asked to do something a little different and step back and share some of the lessons that the Conservancy has learned over the years working on species recovery issues in the Colorado River Basin states. The Nature Conservancy was founded in Hold on one second, there we go. The Nature Conservancy was founded in 1951 and currently has over 1 million members. We work in 69 countries across the world and in all 50 states to conserve the lands and the waters upon which all life depends. This means that we have over 60 years of working with private landowners, water users, and state, federal, local, and tribal governments. In all of its work, the Conservancy strives for conservation approaches that benefit people and nature. And in the Colorado River Basin, this means working to sustain healthy river systems and the people that depend on them. The Conservancy is constantly testing its assumptions in order to learn, adapt, and inform decision-making. And our engagement in species recovery efforts have been no different. And we've learned a number of lessons over the years. And I'd like to share 4 of these with you, drawing from our work over the years, but specifically focusing on our engagement in the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program, and also on sage grouse conservation. And I'd also like to share some thoughts, kind of building on what Kristen mentioned, on where we go from here. And I also just want to mention that I myself don't work on sage grouse conservation issues, but it's been incredibly important work at the Conservancy, and I think it provides some particularly good examples of some of the lessons that we've learned. So the first lesson that we've learned is that collaboration is key. Specifically, we've learned that we need to work collaboratively with our partners in order to develop practical conservation solutions that take into account the economic realities that they're facing. And this approach is really what led to our participation in the Upper Colorado River Endangered Species Recovery Program. So just 5 years after the Supreme Court decided TVA versus Hill, the Upper Colorado River Basin water users were facing something that could have potentially turned into a similar confrontation. Due to the unintended consequences of water development in the Upper Basin, four warm water native fish species were either listed or were on their way to being listed. And these were the Colorado pike minnow, which is overlapping with some of the other programs, as well as the razorback sucker, and the bony tail and the humpback chub. So in order to protect the four fish species, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming were facing the possibility of having to replace all new water depletions with a federal nexus. And that would have effectively stopped water development in the Upper Basin, and that would have had some significant economic impacts. But rather than head to court, a number of the parties decided to try to find an administrative solution. And the Conservancy was concerned about about how the continuing depletions would impact these species, and so they decided to join the parties and participate in the negotiations. And through those negotiations, the water users proposed recovering the species as a way to resolve the conflict. And the parties eventually agreed to that. And a few years later, the Upper Colorado River Program was formed, and the San Juan program followed shortly thereafter. So the goal of this recovery program was similar to the San Juan program, to recover the species by 2023. And these recovery programs have already seen great results in two respects. First, they've shifted ESA compliance from the individual water users to the recovery program. And this has allowed water development to continue in the Upper Basin. The two recovery programs together have provided endangered species compliance for the impacts for over 2,400 existing projects, which is about 3.7 million acre feet in depletions per year. And so they also provide compliance for future projects as well. The second success is that while this water development has been continuing, we've already brought back 2 of these species from the brink of extinction, which I think is a really remarkable achievement considering that these fish evolved over millennia, and we've already been able to bring 2 of them back from the brink of extinction within the lifetime of one of these fish, which, as Krista mentioned, was 40 to 50 years. So that's really remarkable. What's made this collaboration as successful as it has is that we've recognized each other's interests, but we also recognize that we all share a common goal. So the recovery program, similar to the San Juan Basin, is a really unique partnership of local, state, federal agencies, water and power interests, and conservation groups. And each of these participants has an interest in the success of the program. But these interests range from ESA compliance to continued development for water and hydro projects, adherence to state water law, compact compliance, and certainty regarding power generation at certain reclamation projects, as well as continuing to preserve our natural heritage and improve our ecosystems. So these may all be different interests, but as I mentioned, they all require meeting a common goal of recovering the 4 fish species. And this common goal is what really encouraged us to engage in joint research and monitoring efforts that have allowed us to develop a shared understanding of the needs of the fish and of the challenges that they face along the path to recovery. Furthermore, meeting this common goal has also required us to work together to solve a set of problems that none of us individually could solve on our own. And as a result, we've been able to find solutions that really minimize the impacts to water users while still providing water for fish in really innovative ways. In addition, we also have the active involvement of all of the partners. The Upper Colorado Recovery Program is a little bit different than the San Juan program, and all of the management actions are actually developed and implemented with the equal participation of each partner. So it's a consensus-based process. The recovery programs have also enjoyed the bipartisan support of 5 presidential administrations, the Upper Basin states delegations to Congress, as well as Congress itself, which has continuously provided appropriations for this work. And due to this collaboration, no reclamation contractor or water user has suffered an involuntary loss of their water, and there's been very little litigation compared to other Endangered Species Act efforts. So the second lesson that we've learned is that you really need to work from a foundation of good science. A foundation of good science allows us to assess current conditions, identify solutions, make sound decisions, establish measurable goals that you can use to track progress and inform next steps, and also it allows you to engage stakeholders. And our engagement on sage grouse actually really largely focused on building a foundation of good science to move the process forward. Sage grouse used to live in 13 Western states and 3 Canadian provinces, and there used to be something like 12 million birds. But then the sage grouse steppe ecosystem that they depended on became increasingly fragmented and dominated by invasive grasses. And so the sage grouse declined to the point where today there are as few as 200,000 birds left. And 8 years ago, we began working with a very diverse group of partners across the western states in an attempt to turn the tide for the sage grouse through what's now become the largest landscape scale conservation effort in US history. Early on, the Conservancy partnered with agencies and other scientists to understand the threats that were facing the sage grouse and to help build a strategy that would guide conservation to seek protection for places where the most important populations of the sage grouse still remain. And in order to do that, we helped develop a suite of tools that could identify potential geographical conflicts between development and conservation priorities and help guide development to those places where conservation priorities were less. The third lesson we've learned is that the scope and scale of the challenges that we're facing today really demand strategies that are aimed at achieving system scale impact. And while some of our earlier species recovery efforts were very place-based, our work on the sage grouse and on the 4 fish species have shown us that large landscape approaches are the way to go for 3 reasons. First, a large landscape scale approach allows us to work at the scale that matters for the species. For example, the Colorado River pike minnow has long-distance spawning migrations of over 200 miles, and so that required the designation of over 1,000 river miles as critical habitat. So it shows that if we want to recover a species with a large range, we really have to work at a corresponding scale. Second, a large landscape approach allows us to achieve ecosystem-level benefits. In the case of sage grouse, there are over 350 other species that rely on the same habitat. And so by conserving the sage grouse, we're also helping those other species as well. Third, working at a large landscape scale benefits people as well. The Upper Colorado River Recovery Program really has 2 goals. It is to recover the 4 fish species, but also to do this in a way that allows water development to continue. And many people think that these 2 goals are very incompatible, but working at as large of a scale as we do, we have a much better chance of being successful at meeting both goals. As I mentioned, water development has been allowed to continue, so that's a huge benefit to people. But also, working across this large landscape has really allowed us to find flexibility and expand our options for the ways that we work to recover the fish species as well. So the last lesson I want to share with you is that we've learned that we need to look forward and think about the future, be proactive, and adapt what we're doing in order to meet the goals that we've set for ourselves. With sage grouse, these ideas were very much at the forefront, since conservation on a large scale really only began when people started looking forward and realizing that we were facing a potential ESA listing for the sage grouse based on its decline. And this really gave us an opportunity to be proactive and work with our partners in order to figure out how best to meet the needs of the species and keep it from being listed. The recovery program has been very proactive in a different way. As some of the panelists have mentioned, the goals of these programs is recovery and not just to avoid jeopardy. So that in itself is a proactive goal, and that we're working to recover these fish by 2023. But 2023 is coming right up. And as Krista mentioned, we're at this point where we need to ask ourselves, where do we go from here? And the recovery programs and the sage-grouse efforts have really, in many respects, been what's been holding these two large-scale ecosystems together. But if the species are no longer listed, how do we keep our momentum? And if we don't continue to actively conserve these species, then what does it do to the health of the whole systems on which they depend? And in addition, what is it that we need to do to safeguard the system? Not just keep it from crashing, but to really make it, to really keep it healthy and make it resilient so that it can continue to meet all of the demands that we're putting on it. On the Colorado River, we're suggesting that this requires transitioning from a recovery program model and taking a river ecosystem management approach. The good news is that we already have a great foundation for this with all of these recovery programs and with the collaborative efforts over the last few decades to address a number of issues that have arisen at the basin level, such as drought and shortage. So what can you learn from what we've learned? First, that we need to be addressing species conservation at the scale that matters. Second, that we're in this together, and that together we can find creative, durable solutions that benefit both people and nature. And last, that science is a critically important foundation for making sound decisions, and it'll help us develop the tools that we need in order to achieve conservation at the ecosystem scale in a way that benefits both people and nature. We've seen major progress in the 28 years since the recovery program first started, and in the 10 or so years that we've been engaging in sage-grouse conservation efforts. But we also recognize that we're not there yet. And bringing species back from the brink of extinction doesn't happen overnight. It really does take time to develop the processes and the partnerships that are necessary to get you to the end. Despite that, our participation in the recovery program has really led us to believe that it does offer a great model for species recovery efforts. And the sage-grouse, the proactivity involved with the sage-grouse does as well. The recovery programs specifically show us that we can work together to bring species back from extinction. And the sage-grouse effort shows us that we can work together to avoid a species listing in the first place. Both of the examples show us that we can do these things and achieve those goals despite increasing populations and increasing demands on our increasingly scarce resources. But they also remind us that we need to change our focus from a piecemeal approach of working species by species and drop of water by drop of water to conserving systems so that we can achieve long-term benefits for both nature and people. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you guys today. I think we do have time for a few questions. Great.
Thank you, Adeline. Any questions specifically for Adeline? Any questions? Okay. Oh, yes.
I think all your presentations were really very informative and actually pretty satisfying. But I wondered if, particularly maybe Edelin, could you give a specific thing that has been done where someone might see the results of what you've done? Maybe one of you
You repeat your question.
Yeah.
So the question was, can someone please give a specific example of where we can see the results of the actions that have been done? Is that a good summary?
I think with the recovery programs, they provide a particularly good example because you can see on the ground all of the innovative solutions that the groups have come to. And this involves, construction projects, so you can see the fish ladders and the fish passages and all of those physical structures where, they're on the ground being operated and they do track the species that are moving through those structures, and so you can actually start to see these species moving through and accessing habitat that they hadn't been able to reach before. And in some cases, that's spawning habitat, and so, you can, that's a tangible thing that you can see. I don't know if other folks have some other.
Here's another sort of side to that too. In 2014, the two countries, United States and Mexico, implemented a truly remarkable effort, and that was to allow for a pulse flow release of mainstream Colorado River water from Morelos Dam that ultimately made its way down and reconnected the river to the upper Gulf of California. And beyond just the hydrologic and hydraulic beauty of that event occurring, the ability to establish and now maintain habitats of native riparian cottonwood willow and honey mesquite along that stretch of the river, and to set up monitoring programs to monitor bird species and the response to the pulse flow and the continuing maintenance of annual water deliveries to those habitats. Those are the tangible sorts of things that when you're standing out on the landscape you can see. When the Mexican citizens in San Luis Rio, Colorado get to go out and put their feet in a river that's been dry for decades, and to see something happen in their eyes, that's the magic of what we're all doing in these programs. That's one of those tangible benefits that's out there.
For the San Juan program, I think the biggest visual you can see in the basin is the spring peak releases from Navajo Reservoir. We had our first one this year since 2012, and banks had changed. Flow went above what we were anticipating as far as inundating some areas, but it was pretty significant to see that flow come down. And prior to the program, Navajo Reservoir was not being operated for those peak flow releases in the spring.
I guess for the Glen Canyon Dam, the LTEMP plan has not yet come into play, but it will. But a tangible evidence of some of the long-standing work that has gone on there is, that 20 years ago there was a recommendation to do high-flow experiments out of the dam to rebuild some of the beaches and sandbars and protect some of the resources related to them. And just this November, there was one of those high flows, one of those experiments, and you can see the results of that in terms of the sandbars and beaches that have been rebuilt. So.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Great, then please join me in thanking our very talented panel. I believe it's lunchtime.